All right, so let's talk about ADHD and parenting. So chat question number 1, what is the relationship between ADHD and parenting? So let me put it to you this way. Okay. So if I have ADHD, if child has ADHD, what effect does that have on the parent? And if a parent has a particular style, does that affect the ADHD in the kid? Right? These are kind of the two questions. So like, what's the relationship between ADHD and parenting? And the reason that we're going to talk about this today is because I think that when we think about illnesses, we tend to think about them in isolation. But the interesting thing is that they're not really isolated, right? So there's a lot about ADHD, and people, y'all may be surprised by sort of what we discover. We're going to cover a lot of different literature today, but it's really challenging for parents to have a child with ADHD. So I think this is something that is like underappreciated, that like how hard it is to be a parent with a child with ADHD. And on the flip side, how hard it is to be a child with ADHD who has a parent that doesn't understand what your needs and cognitive like limitations or cognitive preferences are, and how that can lead to a lot of negative impacts in the household. So we're going to start off by, the goal of today's lecture is to just explore the relationship between ADHD and parenting, okay? So we're going to start off by kind of defining ADHD. So sure, there's like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There's things like the ICD-11. We're not going to worry about that kind of stuff, okay? So what we're going to talk about is like practically what is ADHD? Like how do you know if you have it? If you're a parent out there, what are the signs that you're going to see in your child that should make you think a little bit about ADHD? And even if they don't have a clear diagnosis of it, if they have these tendencies, then it may be worthwhile to like understand some of the stuff later in the lecture, even without a diagnosis, right? So remember that ADHD is, attention is a spectrum, right? So we have like a spectrum of attention. And so, wow, that's a terrible bell curve. So let me just fix that. And so even though like we may say that if your attention is in this area, this is what we qualify as clinical ADHD. If your child is within this window, we still can, this lecture is still going to be useful for people over here. The other thing that's going to be kind of interesting is a lot of stuff that we're talking about, even if you're not a parent, but if you have a significant other who has ADHD, a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today will be like really relevant. So if your partner has ADHD and you're trying to figure out, okay, like how should I like interact with them? How should I relate to them? What should be the home environment? Like there are things like that that are actually really important. The flip side of this is that if you are someone with ADHD, you may find that there are a lot of problems in your relationship that have to do with some of the stuff that we talk about today. So you can be the person with ADHD and you can have a conversation with your parents. You can have a conversation with your significant other about like some of the things that's a little bit different in your mind and kind of how you work and stuff like that. And how can y'all as people in a relationship, whether it's a parent-child relationship or a non-parent-child relationship, platonic relationship, romantic relationship, how can you understand some of these things to improve the quality of your relationship? So let's start with like, what is ADHD? So ADHD I kind of think about is attentional problems. And what do I mean by that? So people with ADHD oftentimes have distracted attention. But what trips a lot of parents up, or people in terms of self-diagnosis and all that good stuff, is that parents will see their kid and they can like do something for hours without interruption. Right? And so what a parent will do is they'll look at their kid and they'll say, oh, well, like, sure, they get distracted easily and they may have difficulty at school, but like if you give them their particular book, or if they're playing with Legos or they're using an iPad or like whatever, they can do this for hours and hours and hours without interruption. So remember that ADHD is disordered attention. It doesn't necessarily mean a lack of attention. It just means disordered attention. So what we see in ADHD is paradoxically the inability to be interrupted in some cases, and very like too easily interrupted in other cases. So normally what we want is an attention kind of in here, but what we'll find with people with ADHD is there's some symptoms at this end of the spectrum where they can't move attention. And so the main kind of common element here is that sometimes our frontal lobes, we want to direct our attention in a particular place. And people who have ADHD, their frontal lobes just don't comply as easily. So this could be, I need to stop doing this and start getting to other stuff. Or it could be, I need to focus on this one thing and stop doing other things, right? So it's like distraction or inability to stop doing something. So just because your kid is able to play with Legos for 4 hours at a stretch does not mean that they don't have ADHD. In fact, if it is very, very hard to get them to stop playing with Legos, if they cannot control and restrain their attention, whether that's from distraction or overly focusing, both of those are consistent with ADHD, okay? So there are a couple of other things that are kind of just like common qualities. So one is difficulty engaging in academic work. Difficulty with motivation. These are also consistent with ADHD. So if we think about what is motivation, right? The motivation is the ability to focus our attention in a particular area for like a significant amount of time, right? So if I'm motivated to go to the gym, what that means is that my attention is going to be like, okay, like let's go to the gym. I'm going to organize things. So this is another thing that we're going to get to, difficulty with organization. All features of ADHD, right? So if you have difficulty getting organized, you have difficulty getting motivated. And remember that too, motivation it's not a lack of desire, right? It's a lack of like being able to organize your thoughts and move towards a particular direction in kind of like a motivated and concerted fashion. So if your kid has these kinds of challenges, then you may want to consider something along the ADHD spectrum. So remember that this is sort of a Western model, but in Ayurveda, we also have Vata, right? So this is like, you guys can watch Dr. K's guide if you don't know what kind of Vata is, for those of y'all that are familiar with Ayurveda. And people who are high on the Vata spectrum will exhibit signs of ADHD. Right? So it's not necessarily that you need a clinical diagnosis, but if, for example, we become more manic, if we become, drink a bunch of caffeine, things like that, there are all kinds of things that will exacerbate our Vata, including technology usage. And so as our Vata exacerbates, our attention becomes more flighty. So ADHD, this is another big thing that I think sometimes parents will miss, is remember that ADHD is not just about school and work and focus. It actually manifests socially as well. So there have been studies that show that kids with ADHD are more likely to be shy and withdrawn. Now you may ask yourself, well, why is that? Like sometimes kids with ADHD are shy and withdrawn until they discover being a class clown. And now suddenly they know how to become popular. So if your route to popularity is to be the class clown, and if you weren't the class clown, you wouldn't know how to interact with other people in your class, then you might have ADHD, okay? So why are they shy and withdrawn? So this comes down to oftentimes kids with ADHD are neglected by their peers. Also very, very good data supporting this, okay? And so you may wonder, okay, well, like what's going on there? So remember that like if you have attentional problems, it's going to be hard for you to attend to social situations, read the room, as it were, right? Like, so you don't know like where people are. It may be hard to pay attention to a conversation. They may be talking about one thing, and because your mind is so flighty, you start talking about something else. So there are all these kinds of like problems that people with ADHD run into in social situations. So that tends to lead to social isolation, withdrawal. They tend to get neglected by peers, made fun of. The other flip side of this as well is that people with ADHD, remember that you have disordered attention, right? So sometimes people with ADHD will talk about one thing and they won't like read the room and recognize that people are not interested in that subject. So over time, people will just be like socially like not too interested in engaging with an ADHD kid, and it's super sad. Okay? So if your kid has these problems, that's another thing to consider. So the last thing that I'm just going to kind of touch on is passive noncompliance. Now, this is an example of something that I think is very parent-oriented. So y'all may not, this is not something that if you have ADHD, you may not really be able to understand this. But sometimes when you're a parent, you tell your kid what to do. And like sometimes they just ignore you. Like, and so this can lead to a lot of frustration on the parent's part, right? So the parent is like, hey, go put on your shoes, like time to put on your shoes. And the kid is playing with Legos and they just like completely ignore them. So then what ends up happening is that the parent like has to raise their voice, right? So you yet like, hey, put on your shoes. And so then the kid like snaps out of it and then they kind of like look over you and they're like a little bit alarmed, but like now they understand. So they're going to like go put on your shoes. So what's going to happen in this case, so this is what's called passive noncompliance. So kids with ADHD don't listen. Okay? And when they don't listen, parents can get frustrated. And then that frustration leads to a behavioral change. Like raising your voice. And if you do this, they listen. Right? So, what's going on here? So this is a prime example of how ADHD shapes parenting, which we'll see in a second. And in turn, the way that ADHD shapes parenting style can be damaging to the kid. Right? So this is like, in a nutshell, like what we're going to talk about today. Because now what's happening is you have a parent that's like constantly raising their voice. So like now the parent learns, like because your brain is learning too, that speaking softly and politely does not get my kid to listen, and it's time to go and they need to put on their shoes. So instead what I'm going to do is just start barking at my kid all the time because that's what's effective. That's what they need to listen. The challenge here is that it's not that they're not listening, it's that they're not hearing. Right? So this is not defiance. So sometimes when you tell your kid to put on your shoes, your kid is like, no, I don't want to. I want to finish doing this. That's active noncompliance. They know what they're doing. They don't want to do it. They're pushing limits. They're testing boundaries, whatever you want to call it. But with kids with ADHD, a lot of times they're not attending to your voice. So their attention is so focused on what they're doing or so distractible that they literally do not hear and process what you are saying. So it's an attentional problem. So like, and then what happens is the kid gets kind of like confused and starts to feel bad about themselves because mom or dad is always yelling at me all the time, right? Because like I don't listen. And then the parents can also tell the kid like, you need to listen, like please listen. And the kid is like, okay, I'm going to try to listen. I'm going to try to listen. I'm going to try to listen. But then the problem is like they feel bad because like literally that stimulus is not entering their conscious field. Their brain, we have these different kinds of attentional circuits like top-down circuits and bottom-up circuits. I won't go into a bunch of detail with this, but basically your brain has circuits that like pull your attention towards something. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a snake in the middle of the road and I'm having a conversation with my friend, even though my attention is on the conversation with my friend, there's some signal processing going on with my visual cortex that's like, hey, wake the F up. Like, stop talking about philosophy and like there's a snake in front of you, right? So we have all these circuits in our brain that will pull our attention in a particular place. So when a kid has ADHD, we see passive noncompliance because their brain is not attending to the stimuli. So they don't actually like know that their parent is trying to get them to do something. Okay? So if you've got a kid who has attentional problems, maybe has some social difficulties, is a class clown, and especially has passive noncompliance, you may want to, this lecture may apply to you, okay? So now let's kind of move on. So what impact, let's go back to our original two questions, okay? So now we're going to talk a little bit about, if a child has ADHD, what impact does it have on parenting? And if a parent has a particular style, what impact does that have on ADHD? So as we sort of already illustrated through our example, there is actually a reciprocal impact. So what we see with parents and kids is that when you're a parent, you will learn certain coping mechanisms to get your child to do what they're supposed to do. And that unfortunately, a lot of times those coping mechanisms are actually somewhat harmful in the long term. And this is what we sort of see. This is what the literature kind of bears out. So a couple of interesting tidbits. So ADHD in the kid predicts family stress and even parental depression. So parents of kids with ADHD are more likely to be stressed out, and even like affects like their, like how depressed they are. Okay. We also know that the severity of ADHD affects the parenting style of parents. So this is the way in which the parents interact with the kids, and we'll talk about this in a second. And in turn, we also find this, that the parenting style affects severity of ADHD. So what we tend to see is a reciprocal kind of like bi-directional relationship that tends to get worse over time until people figure out what they're supposed to do right. The good news is that all this can be fixed. So essentially what we see is like ADHD leads to bad parenting. And I recognize that that's kind of judgmental and stuff, but we'll go into more detail in a second. And then bad parenting actually makes ADHD worse. And then this kind of becomes a loop. And eventually, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. To the point where we can even make predictions about college performance based on how things were at home. So like this actually has been measured in things like grades and stuff like that, like even at the college level. So let's talk a little bit about what are the different parenting styles. There's been a bunch of research on this. We're going to go over 4 parenting styles. Okay. So the first one is authoritarian. Second one is authoritative. Third one is permissive. And fourth one is, I think, overprotective. That's the right, yeah. Okay. So what are the ways in which we understand these parenting styles? So one is going to be control. One is going to be warmth. And then we'll just general notes. Okay. I'm not going to fill up this section too much, but this is where a lot of what I'll talk about. So authoritarian parents have a high degree of control. Actually, let me just use a symbol. So let's just say high degree of control and low degree of warmth. So these are parents that are harsh. They're involved in your life. They're paying attention to what you do and things like that. They're going to make sure you're studying on time, things like that. But they're not going to be warm and supportive. So these parents tend to be controlling and punitive. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. You need to do this or else this is going to happen. You have not demonstrated to me that you can handle this, so I'm going to do it for you. Right? Actions and consequences. There's they're going to teach you how life works. Okay? So authoritarian parenting styles lead to worsening of ADHD symptoms. ADHD symptoms lead to more authoritarian parenting styles, right? So let's just talk about this for a second or think about this for a second. So if I have a kid who doesn't listen, what I have to end up doing is be harsh with them to get them to listen. So if my kid is playing with Legos and I tell them to put on the shoes and they're not putting on shoes and I'm oh, sweet darling, sweet child, oh my goodness, baby, it's time to put on your shoes, love. Come on, darling, let's go put on our shoes. And the kid is going to continue playing Legos. And so I'm hey, it's time to put on shoes, right? And so the kid feels a little bit hurt. And then they start crying. And then I say, I told you 3 times and you haven't listened. I've told you 3 times to do this and you're not listening. So then daddy gets upset, right? So this is an authoritarian parenting style. The authoritative parenting style actually has high control and high warmth. So these are parents that are structured and supportive. This is basically the best parenting style. So there are studies that show that authoritative parents actually do well in terms of kids' substance use. So, child substance use is like the worst with permissive parents and the best with authoritative parents. So where they provide like structures and boundaries, but they're kind of like warm and emotionally supportive. Okay. So like these are parents that I think of as so a couple of other notes. So these are people with high expectations with little support. So this is another like key aspect of authoritarian parents. So you can think about tiger parents as like being in this category, right? Where they expect a lot from you, but like if you get a B, they're not going to be like, okay, let's sit down and like think a little bit about what's going on and like why you got to be and like how can we help you? Like, are you struggling? Do you need glasses? Like they don't care about that, right? Authoritarian parents are going to be like, you need to get an A. I don't care how you figure it out. You need to get an A, right? So they're not very supportive, but they're like demanding and they have high expectations. So authoritative parents are a little bit different. So they set limits. Set limits with emotional support, right? So it's like you need to get an A, but like I understand things are okay. So like tell me like why, what's hard, what's going on? Like is something going on in your life that seems out of character? Let me understand, like help me understand like what's going on with you. Like why aren't you getting an A? Like is there something I need to know about? What can I do to help? You still need to get an A. Like we're not going to not let you get an A. So we need to correct that behavior. And at the same time, I can be like emotionally supportive while doing so. Okay. Next parent is permissive, which is low control and high warmth. This is the cool parent. Right? So these people are great because they're emotionally supportive, but few boundaries, few limitations or boundaries. Right? So this is the parent who's kind of like, yeah, I'm sorry you got a B, honey. Like, it'd really be nice if you got an A, but, like, do you promise me that you'll study harder? Okay. I love you, darling. Do really good, okay? Mommy loves you no matter what. Like, daddy loves you no matter what. And you promise me you're going to do better, right? Okay. I'm glad we had this talk. Go play your Nintendo. Go ahead. It's okay. I know you're going to do it. Right? So that's a permissive parenting style. Then we've got the overprotective parenting style. So this too can be like sort of high control. And then the warmth is kind of weird. So I would call this like overt warmth, overtly high and covertly low. So these are like overprotective parents tend to restrict autonomy of the kid, tend to be like physically or psychologically controlling. And tend to encourage dependence. Right? So if you can't get an A, like let me go ahead and like arrange a tutor for you, and I'm going to do this for you, and I'm going to do that for you because you can't do it yourself. So like daddy or mommy is going to take over and like you need to do really well, but like I'm going to be there for you, okay? You don't need to learn how to drive at the age of 16. Mommy or daddy are going to be there for you. If you drive, there are drunk drivers on the road. We can't trust your friends. Like they could drive drunk, so I don't want you driving. I don't want you under their influences. Mommy and daddy are going to drive you everywhere. Oh, that's wonderful. You want to go on a date? You have a boyfriend now? That's fantastic. Mommy's so proud of you for having your boyfriend. I'm going to drive you to your date. You're going to sit at this table. I'm going to sit at that table. I won't bother you at all, I promise. And then when you're done with your little date, mommy or daddy will drive you home. Okay? So these are overprotective parents. So what you tend to see in ADHD, so this is where things get kind of interesting. So people have done studies looking at ages 3, 6, and 9. And what they tend to find is that the worse the ADHD is, especially at this phase, less so at 3-year-olds. When you have high ADHD, this leads to increased authoritarian parenting. Okay? When you have, also between these ages, when you have high authoritarian parenting, this leads to worse ADHD. Okay? So it seems like between the ages of 3 and 6, there isn't too much change. So it seems like starting at the age of 6, and I would even say just 6 plus, because you see this stuff at like college ages and stuff like that too. We see a lot of bi-directional effects. So worse ADHD leads to worsening authoritarian kind of parenting, and then authoritarian parenting leads to exacerbation of symptoms of ADHD. So it tends to be, there are a couple of other interesting dynamics here. So it seems like there are gender effects here too, where, for example, let me just make sure I have this correct. So, female kids, here's just examples of different things, okay, are more sensitive, this is going to be a packed sentence, okay, to low authoritative mothers. So this is where, when we get into like the super specifics of the research, we're looking at like different variables, right? So what this basically means is that if you're a girl and you have a mom who is not very authoritative, right? Authoritative is the good one, right? So, hold on. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, authoritative is the good one. So if you have, if you're a female kid who has a low authoritative mother, a mother who does not provide you with structure and emotional support, your ADHD is likely to be like way worse than a male kid, right? So this is where it's just interesting, but as we start looking at these different variables, we start to see different sorts of effects on kids. So for example, dad's parenting style has more of an effect between the ages of 3 to 6 than mom's parenting style. So there are other kinds of interesting, just sort of like semi-random gender effects that we tend to see. Like dads seem to be more impactful from the ages of 3 to 6 than moms are. Female kids with moms that have low authoritative parenting styles tend to have like, we're not necessarily saying that they're high authoritarian, right? So do y'all understand that there's like a difference there? You can be low on one and high on the other, but it's really the variable is low authoritative that girls tend to be sensitive to later in life. So there are all kinds of specific effects. We'll give you guys a list of the resources and stuff. You guys can read the papers yourself if you want to, okay? So there are different kinds of effects here. And so there's a key finding here that's really important. So then what people did is they looked at these different effects, right? And they saw this reciprocal kind of relationship. And then so what then researchers started doing is intervening. So researchers started asking the question, okay, if we move from an authoritarian to an authoritative, right? So this one is controlling. This one is structured and supportive, just to give you guys an example, like a reminder, right? Because I know that the terms are similar. So what they did is, if we train parents in moving from authoritarian to authoritative, what happens? And the cool thing that they discovered is that ADHD improves. So if you alter the way in which you parent, you can actually affect the ADHD of your child. And this correlates with all kinds of stuff, okay? So it correlates with like improved academic performance, improved ability to like meet goals, improved social outcomes. So if you like literally change the way in which you parent, your child's ADHD will improve. Now there's another really, really key finding here, which is fascinating, is that when you change the parenting style, the inattention does not improve, but grades improve. Okay, so now this gets a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to explain this. So when we measure a kid with ADHD, there are like tests that we can do to see how their attention functions. Like how long can you read this boring paragraph, for example, before your eyes start wandering? And then there's other things that we measure as well, which is like not just like your attention at a task, but outcomes, like what happens to your grades, what happens to your social situation, what happens to your sense of depression, your self-worth, all these kinds of things. And we've assumed as a psychiatric industry, we've assumed that increasing attention is the mechanism to improve grades, right? So then what we do as psychiatrists is we prescribe stimulants. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you a pill that will improve your attention. Therefore, we will increase the grade. And so stimulants lead to improved grades, right? That's what psychiatry believes. But what parenting studies actually show is really fascinating is the fundamental attentional stuff does not improve. Their ability to pay attention to a paragraph does not seem to get better. But what does improve is the grades. And this is a really, really, really important finding, because what this suggests is that fixing the attention doesn't automatically fix everything downstream. In fact, providing the right kind of parenting style is sufficient to improve your grades without fixing the attention with stimulants, right? So what this actually means is that like you don't need stimulants. Like you can actually, I mean, you may need depending on your clinical situation, but this fundamental like assumption that psychiatry has that stimulants are what you need appears to actually not true, that you can actually teach parents how to parent properly and parent their child appropriately with ADHD, and the kids' outcomes will improve despite the fact that you're not altering their neurochemistry. So then the question naturally becomes, what's the relationship between stimulants and parenting? And this is what's really fascinating. When you give a kid a stimulant, it decreases authoritarian parenting. So this is fascinating, incredibly fascinating, right? So when a kid is on a stimulant and they're able to attend a little bit better, the parent actually needs to yell less. They're able to like, you know, attend to the parent more, so the parent doesn't go into this cycle over here, right? So once you fix the stimulant, this goes away, so then this goes away, and this goes away. They just start by listening. And so it's kind of like really interesting there, right? And so this is kind of what we sort of learn, which is that at the end of the day, the way in which you parent your child will actually affect their ADHD symptoms, will in turn affect your own mental health if you kind of parent them appropriately, and will lead to better outcomes for your kid. So then everyone's going to be asking, so if you guys want to see, let's just look at a couple of these papers real quick, okay? So let me see what's something that's kind of digestible. Let me show you guys if you guys just want to, we'll include these references hopefully somewhere, but I'll just flash them here so you guys can look at the VOD. So here's one of the papers that we looked at, maternal parenting style and internalizing and ADHD symptoms in college students. These studies are actually really cool, by the way. Parenting is a mechanism of change in psychosocial treatment for youth with ADHD, right? So like that's exploring the mechanism of change when you adjust your parenting. A longitudinal study of the relation between family functioning and preschool ADHD symptoms. So these are like papers looking at college students and preschool, okay? Family impact and parenting styles in families of children with ADHD. So this is a great paper that just kind of talks about it all. And then this is the one that we're going to, I think, talk about now for a second. So examining differences. Oh, no, wait, hold on. I'm missing one. Huh. There we go. This is the one I'm missing. So mindfulness for children with ADHD and mindful parenting, MindChamp, a qualitative study on the feasibility effects. So this is a study that looks at actually an intervention where they taught parents the MindChamp program, right? So this, I don't know if you all are aware of this, but MindChamp is an evolution of the PogChamp emote, which has now been banned, I understand, right? So we need a MindChamp emote. Petition Twitch, chat. So now what everyone is going to be asking is, okay, so, there we go. So what everyone's going to be asking is like, if you're a parent or you're a kid and you're trying to figure out, or you're a romantic partner or whatever, platonic friend, you know, how do I parent properly? So there's a lot of different stuff that people have measured, right? To see what are the key things that determine whether someone like is doing a good job of parenting or not a good job of parenting. What are the things that are important? So the first is to be structured instead of reactive. So let me actually do it this way. Is greater than reactivity. What does that mean? So I'll give you guys a story from my personal life. So I have a kid who's like super high vata. And what I found is that like getting her ready for school in the morning can be a 5-minute process that is easy and simple, or it can be a half-hour process with a lot of like frustration and yelling and like, you know, things like that. So what I find is that when I'm, you know, have a high vata child, what I have to do is be like super, super structured about it. So for example, like we get her clothes ready, we get her toothbrush ready, we get all of her stuff ready, and it's placed in the bathroom. Whereas in the past, what we would do is like we'd brush our teeth in one place, we'd go to the closet to get dressed, we'd then like go get our socks because we keep our socks and shoes like, you know, by the door, and then we'd put on our shoes, and like, so it's like it's like there's phase 1 is brush teeth and go potty, phase 2 is move to location number 2 and put on clothes, and phase 3 is like put on socks, shoes, and coat. And what I find is that each time there's a transition, her attention can wander and she'll like start playing with something. If she starts playing with something, then I have to like react to it, right? And then I'll also get frustrated and I'll be like, oh my God, like she feels like a fish that's gotten like loose from the net, and then she'll just like run away and do whatever she wants to. Okay? And so what we want to end up doing is being as structured as possible. So this is where like we get the clothes, the toothbrush, we close the door to the bathroom, and we're not leaving the bathroom until we have our coat, socks, toothbrush, you know, teeth brushed, went potty, changed clothes, put on socks and coat right there. And then we're going to leave the bathroom. And then we'll put on our shoes right by the door on the way out. So you want to be as structured as possible and try to be as non-reactive as possible. Second thing, impose limits without emotion. This is a key one, okay? So you want to set boundaries. Like, by all means, you want to set boundaries. The problem, or even enforce boundaries. The problem is that oftentimes parents will impose those limits or set boundaries or enforce boundaries when they themselves are pissed. And so, like, it's hard for a kid because, first of all, they're doing something wrong. But when you're yelling at them, like, they may learn because they're going to be learning, like, their limbic system will be active and it'll be teaching them lessons. But there's going to be, like, negative impacts to self-worth is going to go down, right? Like, they know that you're angry with them, so they're going to, like, feel bad. You're going to be angry with yourself, right? Because you're yelling at your kid and you don't want to be yelling at your kid. So as best as possible, try to set limits without being emotional, right? And this is where we have to be super, super careful, because this translates into a weird thing sometimes where parents are like, I'm not supposed to be emotional with my kid, so I'm going to talk like this. I'm not going to be emotional at all. No emotions. Child, you have been a bad child today. Therefore, I'm going to have to take away your toy. No angry, no yelling, no emotion. Right? So sometimes parents will do this, where there's another version of this that I've heard historically and recently, which is like, yeah, we don't punish our kids because punishment is bad. We should use positive reinforcement. And then they'll say things like, okay, so like, we're not going to do timeout because timeout is a punishment. We're going to take a break, or we're going to do something else, right? And so they'll use this weird language, and what they end up doing is like punishing the kid. They just don't call it a punishment, right? It's like super weird. And that screws kids up even more. Like, so I had a patient who got so screwed up. It's like nuts, where the parents like would never punish the kid because they were super into like not punishing kids. So instead what would happen is, oh, like you're acting out. The reason you're acting out is because you ate, I kid you not, gluten. And so since you're acting out, this is the gluten's fault. It's not your fault because heaven forbid, we're not going to punish you. There's nothing wrong with you. You are the perfect child. It is the gluten that's causing the problem because it's flaring up your IBS. Therefore, wait for it, no cupcakes. You're acting out, therefore it's the gluten's fault, therefore no cupcakes. And the kid gets like super confused, right? Because they see the acting out and they see the removal of the cupcake. They just can't handle like, and then it gets really weird because if you're punishing a kid, but you don't call it punishment, that screws up the kid more than just punishing them than calling them punishment. Y'all get that? Like if you're punishing a kid, just at least be authentic about it and be honest about it. Because then the kid winds up in my office, I kid you not, no pun intended. And then they've got this weird fucking relationship with like food because of this. And every time that something bad happens, so they're like dating someone and they feel emotionally hurt and they start blaming the cupcakes. And it's like, then I have to do the work of rewiring this person's brain. And it's like, no, you're not feeling bad because of the gluten. You're feeling bad because your partner was emotionally unsupportive. It didn't like respond to your texts. Right? And so like you get this, like, so if you're going to punish your kid, like punish your kid. Try to do it without emotion. Now, this is the other key thing. Without emotion does not mean suppressing your emotion so you have a monotone. Child, you have misbehaved. Therefore, I'm going to set a limit on you without emotion. No emotion, no elevated voice, nothing. No, I'm calm, I'm collected, I am good, and you, my friend, are screwed, but with no emotion. This is not actually no emotion. So this is the other thing that parents tend to do, is when we say do something without emotion, they think what that means is suppress the emotion. But here's the thing, and we see this a lot with toddlers, right? Toddlers like know maybe like 50 words. They're like 2-year-olds, right? So when you don't use the language of emotion, punishment, sorry, and like you don't display like, if you don't like overtly punish them, they're very, very attuned to you emotionally and empathically. So you can act like you're not emotional, but a 2-year-old will absolutely understand exactly what you're feeling because that's all they've got to work with, right? They don't have vocabulary. They don't have logic. They don't understand reasoning. All they can do is like read your facial expression and understand that like mommy and daddy are like not happy with me and I kind of screwed up. And then you tell your kid, no, you didn't screw up. This is not a punishment. You didn't screw up. And then the kid gets super confused and they're like, what? And then they wind up in my office, right? So you're damn right 2-year-olds read your mind. That's exactly what they do because that's all they know how to do because they don't have words, they don't have language, they don't have logic. So all they have to do is like super high empathic circuitry. Okay? It's kind of bizarre. They're like very, very attuned to things. And it's like you can change your facial expression to like make a kid cry like super easily because that's all they've got to work with. They've got no history, no context. All they can do is like read your facial expression. It's like 100%. Like they'll read exactly what's going on. Okay? So as a parent, like what should you do? Right? So you want to impose limits without emotion. And if you say, okay, well, how do I impose limits without emotion? This is where like you process emotions. So if you're feeling angry with your kid, you've got to like kind of work through that yourself. Okay? So there's a couple of things that are important here. So one is like awareness of your emotions. This is what you should do if you're a parent, right? So how do we get here? We get here by doing this. So like, what are you feeling? Okay, I'm feeling frustrated. Like acknowledge that, right? And you can even acknowledge it to your kid. And you can say, hey, daddy is feeling kind of frustrated with you right now, and I'm going to do my best to set that aside. I really don't want to be frustrated with you, and daddy's working on that. I really need you to put on your shoes. And I'm sorry if I'm saying that in a way that hurts your feelings. Like, can you please do that for daddy? You just say that. Right? And then you can ask them, hey, is it the way that daddy's talking to you, does it make you feel bad? Okay, then let me give you a hug. Right? So like you can be frustrated, but you don't want to impose the limit with that frustration. It's like that simple. Right? It's not necessarily easy to learn how to talk like that, but like you can acknowledge your emotions to your child and like kind of check in with them. So as a parent, you want awareness of your emotions. Okay? Second thing is you yourself need to be like careful about being as non-reactive and making sure you're emotionally regulated. Right? So this kind of goes back to, now I'm using some of the language of the research paper. So this is like processing your own emotions. So you can cultivate like detachment. So this is like our HG bread and butter stuff. So the cool thing about paying attention to HG is that we will make you better parents, whether you realize it or not. Because we're teaching y'all to be detached, right? We're teaching y'all to like understand your emotions. We're teaching you to be less alexithymic. Another big thing is acceptance. And so this too is like related to this, right? So you got to kind of just accept that like some of this stuff isn't going to be perfect, right? So whether if my kid is like late for school, yelling at them is not going to make a difference. Like they're late. So we can definitely have a conversation about it. We can impose some kind of punishment or whatever. But like you as a parent can accept that things are just not going to be perfect. And so if we think about like acceptance, like which parenting style does not enjoy acceptance at all? Which parenting style is the hallmark of a lack of acceptance? Do y'all remember? Yes. The authoritarian parenting style. Where acceptance is the enemy, right? Acceptance is exactly what we want to avoid. Like, we don't want to accept our kid for who they are. Like, screw that. We want our kid to be what we want them to be. Screw acceptance. Acceptance leads to subpar results. And this is the really sad thing, is that is actually like not true. In fact, the opposite, right? What we tend to discover through research is that actually like accepting your kid for where they're at and still sort of imposing limits and boundaries and structure with love is actually the way to go. So as a parent, you want to be structured instead of reactive. So if you've got a kid with ADHD, don't give them opportunities to get distracted, right? So you want to like not have to respond and chase them around. This is what drives parents absolutely crazy, because then you're chasing your kid around all the time. You're stressed out, you get frustrated. What should take 5 minutes is now taking half an hour. You don't have your own time to take care of yourself. So self-care is actually another important part. Something that parents woefully neglect is like taking care of themselves, because if you are calm, cool, and collected, you will do a better job of taking care of your kids. And this is what we've seen in our parent program is like we'll give our parents, like we'll teach them communication skills. We'll teach them how to set boundaries and stuff like that. But a big part of what we do for parents is actually emotional support. And this is where like, you know, we get them in a room together and we talk about, okay, well, what's it like for you having a kid who's addicted to video games? It's like terrifying, right? Like they're scared. They're scared that their kid is like 19 years old. They failed their first year of college. And the parent is terrified. They're like, what if I can't control this? Like, what if this continues? They're going to be homeless. Like, what's going to happen to them once I pass away? Like, if they're not able to take care of themselves, they have all this fear rolling around inside of them. And then anytime they have a conversation, it's going to like show up with the kid, right? So we actually had this case yesterday where someone was sharing with me that, you know, the parent was concerned about their kid, and they said like, I'm worried about what's going to happen to you when I'm gone. And that's a devastating thing to share with a child. Like, the kid can't handle that emotional amount because they know you're right. Like, they know you're right. If you're a parent who has enabled your child and you have like a man child for a kid or a woman child for a kid, and like you do like their laundry and stuff, like, and you worry about what's going to happen, and that's a completely valid worry that is going to terrify your kid because they know it's true. They know that once you leave, like they're old enough to understand they don't do their laundry, they don't pay their bills, they don't have a job. So if you're a kid like that, like it's terrifying to face that reality that your parent isn't going to be there one day. And then that negative emotion that the kid deals with in turn is going to shatter their motivation. It's not going to like scare them straight. It's going to like, that's what drives them to the game in the first place. And then like they get driven to the game and like now they retreat because like their life is going nowhere. And when your parent is like, by the way, your life is going nowhere. And the kid is like, yeah, I know. They lash out at the parent and they retreat to the video game. And then the cycle perpetuates. Right? So how do you do this? You take care of your own emotions as a parent. Somewhere else. You take care of yourself. You do what you need to. If you need that glass of Zinfandel on Thursday at 4 p.m., you go for it. Right? I don't actually recommend that because using alcohol as a coping mechanism is a bad idea. Let's say if you need your bath on a Sunday morning, you go for it. Okay? So, this is ADHD and parenting. To summarize, it's kind of interesting because a lot of people wonder what's the relationship between parenting and ADHD. right? So if I have an ADHD kid, do I need to parent differently? The answer is absolutely yes. For kids with ADHD, you may wonder, like, what is my parents' impact on my ADHD? And the interesting thing is that it appears that children with ADHD stress their parents out and result in changes in parental behavior, which in turn, those changes in parental behavior lead to worsening in ADHD symptoms. And it's absolutely a bidirectional effect. And so I'm not trying to share this with y'all for the purpose of like, blaming your parents and being like, you screwed me up. Now I'm failing out of college because you didn't parent me well enough. And I don't want the parents to feel guilty because they're like, oh, I screwed up, because if I had been a more authoritative parent instead of an authoritarian parent, then my kid would be like getting a 4.0 in college. That's not the point of this. The point of this, and those feelings can come up and they're actually quite natural. The point is, even if that does come up, like the two of y'all have a relationship and the child needs to acknowledge that, hey, maybe if you did things differently, like life would be easier for me. And at the same time, like, child also needs to acknowledge that, like, I can't really blame you for this because it's not like anyone teaches you this stuff, right? So it's sort of like not the parent's fault. And then you guys can start building bridges from where you are now, right? As a parent, you can acknowledge that maybe if you knew more about this, like, you would have done a better job and you wouldn't have like put your kid in the situation they're in. So you can apologize that for as a parent. As a kid, you can forgive them if you both admit to like what the situation is. And then you guys can be on the same team. Like, there's like, avoiding making mistakes is not the way that you build a relationship. You acknowledge the mistake, you forgive people for the mistake, and even then, it's the child's place to say, if they're kind of mature about it, they're going to say, like, actually, I can't really blame you for that, but I appreciate the apology. I don't hold it against you, but I'm glad, you're accepting responsibility. But I don't blame you at all. I love you very much. Let's work on it now. Like, that's what we're looking for at the end, right? So at the end of the day, though, ADHD and parenting is super tricky. And the good news is that if you adjust your parenting style, you can actually affect the symptoms of ADHD. So this is where being more authoritarian, being more structured and emotionally supportive, as opposed to disciplinarian or controlling, or permissive, where you let the ADHD kid do whatever they want to, or where you let them, like, you're overprotective and you start doing things for them, because parents will like default to any of those things, right? Either I'm going to yell at you, I'm just going to do it for you because you've got ADHD and you can't do it yourself. Or I'm going to just like, I'm done with this. I don't know what to do about this. Throw your hands up and let your kid do whatever he wants to. So the permissive, overprotective, or authoritarian style, those are all non-ideal. The challenging thing is that the authoritative style, which is kind of the right move, is difficult. It's hard. It requires self-care on the part of the parent. It requires awareness on the part of the parent. It requires like acceptance. It requires being thoughtful and like building in structure and trying to not be as reactive as possible and processing your own emotions. So it's hard, but the good news is that you can alter that. So if you're someone in a relation, if you've got ADHD and you see this kind of stuff in your parents, recognize that some of what your self-esteem is may not be because your parents are actually like think you're crap, but like some of those emotions, which even if you know your parents love you, those emotions are coming from experiences where your parents had to react because they didn't know any better. And similarly, if you're in a romantic relationship now or platonic relationship now, understand that structure and non-reactivity will help the relationship, right? So you can implement these from any which way. Questions? Could you talk about how the relationship changes when the parent has ADHD as well as it's quite genetic? Yeah, absolutely. So if a parent, not only ADHD, but when a parent has any kind of psychopathology, it leads to worsening symptoms in the kid. Okay? So like you can have a parent with anxiety that'll lead to worsening symptoms with ADHD. There's also so ADHD is not the only illness that we examined. I mean, I'm not going into all the detail because that's, So for example, this paper looked at not only ADHD, but oppositional defiant disorder, depression, and anxiety. I think there's some paper that looks at OCD too. And then there's plenty of data. Let me see if I can find if one of these references. I mean, I read more than this. Let me see if there's parenting. Nope. Yeah, so you can also look at this paper, which looks at Let me see if I can find this real quick. So there's like family stress. Here we go. You ready for it? Man, I'm good. Sometimes I gotta say, Dr. K is good. To remember where the paragraph is in which paper, like sometimes I'm proud of myself. So parent ADHD symptoms. So using a 4-point Likert scale, if a parent responded 2 or 3 for symptom, okay. So this paper did look at parent ADHD. So this is the paper, a longitudinal study of the relationship between family functioning and preschool ADHD symptoms. So let me see if I can find the result. Okay, so this is going to be a bit complicated, so I'll try to find this for y'all, okay? No, here we go. This is the paper this is the one we want. No. So this looks at the impact of, for example, maternal depression, right? So we can see what the impact is. These are statistically significant. We can look at parental, so they're not looking at, one of these is not summarized. So you can look at like maternal life stress, seems to have a negative correlation with ADHD. Let's look at depression and anxiety. I think that's what we want, actually. Right, and the key thing here is that maternal depression or paternal depression is going to have an impact on the ADHD. And then that impact changes based on which category of kid you're talking about. And if you guys look here, it looks like the impact from mothers is greater than fathers. But the short answer is that ADHD for parents will absolutely affect the ADHD of the child. And it's not just ADHD in parents, right? So there's evidence that, for example, being an overprotective parent increases the anxiety of your child. There are even studies that show that giving parents anti-anxiety medication, if they have an anxiety disorder, has a clinical benefit in the kid. So when you're an anxious parent who is overprotective, you will pass on that anxiety to the kid. And if you medicate yourself or get treatment yourself, that will result in your kid having less anxiety. So, but what should ADHD kids say to a single parent to describe to them what's happening, especially if a parent thinks you're just trying to change them in a negative way? My mom tends to blame me for everything, but not to accept that I'm in the ADHD spectrum. So that's a really tough question, but a really good question. So I would start by having an open-ended conversation with your parents. So start to ask them. So take a particular example. Like if you had some kind of conflict, let's say you didn't take out the trash and your mom gets upset with you, and you can sort of ask her, how do you see this situation? What do you think is going on here? Right? And she'll say you're just, you're criticizing me. Maybe they'll perceive any kind of conversation as a criticism. That can happen. So this is what's really tricky, is that if parents know they're doing a bad job and you try to bring up to them that things are not ideal, that suppressed thought of I'm doing a bad job comes roaring back, and they push back against it, right? So there's suppressive mechanisms that are pushing down the thought that I'm screwing up, because that is the most devastating thought to a parent, right? If your parent loves you, you can get some really bizarre behavior, because if I'm screwing up as a parent and I love my kid, that's terrifying. I can't deal with that. So what I do is I suppress that. And then what happens is I end up getting hypersensitive to any kind of criticism of my parenting, because deep down, I am insecure about it, right? It's just like any other insecurity. If I'm afraid I'm an idiot, then what I need is 1,000 people to tell me I'm smart every single day. And if a single person calls me an idiot, I'm going to push back against them so hard. So this is where it's having a gentle conversation with them, where if they start to get defensive, you can sort of ask, what are you hearing me say? Are you hearing me say that you're a bad parent? You can just ask them that question. And then you can even tell them, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we have a conflict, and I'm trying to figure out how we can work through this conflict. I don't believe I'm 100% at fault. I don't believe you're 100% at fault. And in fact, two people cannot be at fault individually, but when you have a relationship, there's going to be some kind of friction that occurs because you've got more than one human. So I just like to explore with you, like, what do you think is going on, like, in our relationship? Why do you think these conflicts keep happening? Let's try to understand it, because I love you and I want to have a healthy relationship with you. And sometimes relationships need a little bit of work. What do you think about that? Right? So you can try things like that, but that's super challenging. Like, generally speaking, you know, if you've got a defensive kind of like suppressing parent and you're a kid with ADHD, it's hard to do that. What you could also do is send them this lecture and just use that as a backdrop.